friendship that'll never ever end.
Run!
It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood. Reaction video 584. In the neighborhood, my brothers and sisters. Another Sunday, another time to get into one of these true crime, horror, dark, deep, and mysterious, what the is going on type of videos. And y'all know that we're about to go back to the man. We're about to go back to the myth. We about to go back to the legend. MrBallen. MrBallen Sundays, y'all. And the title of the video is Top 2 Most Selfish Criminals. Sounds fake, but 100% true. Episode 31. Mature audiences only. Now I'm just wondering, man, what do MrBallen really mean by most selfish criminals? Because for me, I think some of the most selfish criminals out there, y'all, is the freaking murderers that murder people, and then before they can get caught and be held accountable for the murders that they committed, they end up killing themselves, man. You know what I'm saying, y'all? I hate those type of freaking murderers. I hate all murderers. I'll just put that out there. You know what I'm saying? But those really get on my nerves because it's so selfish to kill people, and then before you can face any type of consequences on earth, you decide to end your own life too. I freaking hate that. I hate that. But I digress. I don't know if that's where MrBallen going in this story, but we're about to see. But before we see, my brothers and sisters, y'all know what y'all got to do. Get whatever you may need. Get what you need, please. We are back to the man, the myth, the legend, MrBallen. Y'all got what y'all need, y'all ready to go? Then let's go.
Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction, and today I'm going to share 2 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button leaves their phone out unattended, go ahead and pick it up and spam passwords over and over again until it locks them out of their phone for a week. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. At around 8 p.m. on December 16th, 2023, a 31-year-old man named Nestor Flores was driving down a highway just outside of Dallas, Texas, with both his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel. Nestor was very stressed out on this ride. All he wanted to do was get home because he was worried that on this ride, he might get pulled over by police. I mean, this was a route he had driven a bunch, and he knew there were loads of state troopers that patrolled the area. And from his perspective, it seemed like they kind of pulled people over all the time. And Nestor had spent the night out with a couple of friends, and he had had a couple of drinks. You know, he didn't feel he had had too much to where he couldn't drive, but he knew if he did get pulled over, you know, he could be in trouble. And then on top of that, you know, in the back of Nestor's mind was the fact that he had had a couple of minor run-ins with the law over the past couple of years. And so he kind of had this fear of police already. And also, Nestor was not born in America. And so he was worried that on top of all that, if he got pulled over, you know, he could risk being deported. And so on whole, Nestor just does not want to see any police officer. He just wants to get home and go to bed. And so as Nestor is doing his best to not draw any suspicion to himself and is trying to follow all the rules of the road, he decides to have a sip of his Diet Coke. And his Diet Coke was right in the middle console. And so as he's driving eyes straight ahead, he reaches down and he grabs the Coke, he pulls it up, he uncaps it, takes a sip. But then as he puts the drink back down, again, he's keeping his eyes on the road, he hits something with the drink. And he feels the drink slosh out of his cup and it hits his hand. And instinctively, he took his eyes off the road and looked down at the Coke, and he managed to put the drink back in its cup holder. And then when he brought his eyes back to the road, there was a deer in the middle of the road. He was too close to swerve out of the way, and so at full speed he smashes into this deer. The deer hits his front windshield and basically caves in the passenger side windshield and flips up and over the back of his car. And Nestor amazingly was composed enough to not swerve wildly post-impact, because he knew if he did that he could run into oncoming traffic or something. And so he just kept on going straight and gradually slowed down and pulled off the side of the road. And as he did, he looked over his shoulder, seeing if this deer was basically lying in the road, or even worse, maybe it hit some other car. But when he looked over his shoulder, the road was clear. There was no deer. Now, even though
I just want to point out that Nestor is freaking lucky to be alive, y'all, because I know some people personally who have died from getting in accidents by hitting deers. And I was a little child, you know what I'm saying? I was in the back seat. It was me, two of my sisters, they boyfriends. Long story short, story long, we was going to my uncle, rest in peace, to my Uncle Frank funeral down in Florida. And I was in the back seat and seen when we hit a deer that day. F the freaking car up, you know what I'm saying? Luckily, it was a rental, and we went and got another car, all that. But I'm just saying, man, y'all, hitting a deer on the road can be life-threatening.
Nestor was obviously very shaken up at this point. I mean, he just had this horrible car accident with this deer, and he's already on edge about getting pulled over by police. But for the moment, it was just peaceful on the highway. No cops were coming up to him, and he's pulled over to the side. Physically he was okay. It seemed like the deer was okay. It clearly ran off the road or something. And there was damage to his car. I mean, the deer really smashed in the front of his car, and the windshield, especially on the passenger side, was basically caved in. But Nestor was able to see through his side of the windshield, and when he put the car back in drive and hit the gas, the car seemed to drive just fine. And so even though Nestor felt kind of bad that he had smashed this deer, he thought, what am I going to do? Go find the deer and make sure it's okay? Like, he can't really do anything. It's nighttime. And so he made the decision that, nobody saw this, and it seems like everything's okay, so I'm just going to drive home and I'll take care of my car tomorrow. But after driving 38 more miles from the impact site, Nestor's car began making this horrible rattling sound from the engine, and also smoke began to billow up out of the front of his car. And so Nestor knew, this is so conspicuous, he's gonna get pulled over if he doesn't stop. And so feeling really annoyed, because he was actually pretty close to home at this point, Nestor pulled off the highway and came to a stop in a parking lot of a fast food restaurant. And so at first, all Nestor did was just turn off his car and wait for a couple of minutes in hopes that, that would be enough to cure his car. But after a couple of minutes, the smoke continued to billow out of his car, and then when he tried to turn it back on again, the car simply wouldn't start. And so at this point, Nestor knew he had to call a tow truck. But when he reached for his phone was dead, and he didn't have a phone charger in his car, and so he's like, great, I can't even call a tow truck. But then he looked up and saw the fast food restaurant was open, and he decided he would just go in there, and he would ask one of them if they had a charger. So Nestor gets out of his smoking car, he walks into the restaurant, he goes up to the counter, and he asks the person behind the counter, like, hey, my phone's dead, do you have a charger? Do you mind charging my phone? But the employee, they didn't say anything back to Nestor. They just stood there with their mouths open and their eyes wide, staring at Nestor, like they couldn't believe what they were looking at. And so Nestor's thinking, like, what's wrong with this person? Hey, do you have a charger or not? And the employee, who by this point is pale as a ghost, just shook their head at Nestor, like, no, they don't have a charger. And then they just...
Okay, time out, man. Something is going on with Nestor. He got some type of injury. Like, he might got a piece of the deer, goddamn, what it is, antler stuck in his head and don't even know it, man. Like, it's something wrong with him that I don't think he realized yet. And them people, they looking like, dude, do you know what you look like right now? And you asking for a phone charger? You need to be asking for someone to please dial 911.
just stood there, still staring at Nestor. And so now Nestor is genuinely just furious. I mean, the whole night has completely derailed here. All he wanted to do was get home, and it's like one horrible thing happens after another. And so Nestor was just like, okay, fine. And he turned around and he left the restaurant and went back to his car, thinking maybe if I search the whole vehicle, there's bound to be a charger in there somewhere. And so Nestor gets back into his car, he climbs into the driver's seat, he shuts the door, and as he begins looking around his car for this charger, he begins to feel really sleepy. And actually, he eventually just kind of leans forward and falls asleep in his car. More than 2 hours later, Nestor woke up to the sound of somebody tapping on his window. And so Nestor groggily turned and looked, and it was like the worst case scenario. It was a police officer who was shining his flashlight into the vehicle, clearly gesturing for Nestor to roll his window down. And so Nestor was totally compliant. He rolled the window down and he looked at the officer, and before Nestor could even say anything, the officer said, "Get out of the car." So Nestor, he gets out of the car and he's thinking to himself, why is he acting so aggressively towards me? Like, what have I done here? And so Nestor, he gets out of the car, and again, before Nestor can ask any questions, the officer just says to Nestor, "What happened tonight? Like, what's going on here?" And so Nestor, he knows his car is jacked up, and here he is sleeping in the parking lot. And so he turns to the officer and begins explaining the deer story. He was driving down the road, he hits this deer, it went over the top, he didn't see it, he didn't report it. And as he's telling the officer this, he's thinking, oh my gosh, like, is there a law? Like, if you hit a deer, are you supposed to report it? Is that what's going on? Maybe the deer did die, and it was in the middle of the road, and somebody saw his license plate, and now the cop was here. And so Nestor began to panic, trying to explain the logic behind leaving the deer, and how sorry he was, he should have stopped, he should have called the police. But the officer finally just put up his hand, telling Nestor to stop talking, and then the officer took his flashlight and he shined it past Nestor at his car. And when the officer did that, the officer immediately grabbed his radio and began barking orders into it, saying he needed backup. And so Nestor's like, what is going on here? Like, this whole night has been such a disaster. Like, what did I do? And so Nestor, he turned to see what the cop was looking at on his car that would elicit such a big response from him. And when he looked at the passenger seat of his car, where the cop's light was now shining, Nestor froze for a second and then just started to scream. It would turn out that even though Nestor believed he had only had, a few drinks and he was okay to drive, the reality was he was completely annihilated drunk and should never have been behind the wheel. And when he was driving on the highway, anxiously trying to get home, well, he didn't hit a deer. He hit a 45-year-old pedestrian named Terry Ivory, and he hit this guy with so much force that Terry went through the windshield on the passenger side and then landed in the passenger seat, minus one leg, which had been severed on impact. And then Terry's dead body sat there in the passenger seat with Nestor having no idea. He thinks there's a deer back there, but there was never a deer. There's just a dead guy next to him. And Nestor just drove 40 more miles with Terry's dead body next to him. And then when Nestor's car began to smoke and make noises, he pulled off the highway to that fast food restaurant parking lot. And then when he went inside the restaurant to try to get a phone charger, the reason that employee was so shocked to see Nestor and could basically not even speak when Nestor was trying to talk to them was because Nestor was covered practically head to toe in blood, Terry's blood. Now, it's not entirely clear why that employee did not immediately call police, but, after Nestor left the restaurant, went back to his car, and fell asleep, during the time Nestor was sleeping, someone inside the restaurant did call the police, and that's why they showed up and knocked on Nestor's glass. Nestor was charged with collision involving death in December of 2023. However, his case has not yet been adjudicated.
Holy sugar, honey, iced tea bean team. Now, I was completely wrong, man. I thought Nestor probably had some freaking injury that he ain't know about. You know what I'm saying? Like, something sticking out of his head, like a big ass piece of glass or something, and that's why he had fell asleep, like he fell unconscious or something. You know what I'm saying? I was completely wrong. I had this one backwards, y'all. I was not expecting that. What the freak, man? Do you know how drunk you gotta be, my brothers and sisters, to not realize that you got a dead body in your goddamn car, in your passenger seat, right next to you while you drive 40 more miles? That man was shit-faced drunk. That's what you call that. He was shit-faced drunk, man. Jesus freaking Christ. How you hit somebody and think it's a deer and don't realize that they went through the windshield and now they in your car, minus the leg that was decapitated? What the? Man, come on, Nestor, bro. And I guess he will go down for manslaughter for that or whatever. But I just feel like he need to face a whole bunch of years, regardless. You know what I'm saying, man? Regardless of if he tried to do it or not. And I ain't gonna lie, I keep it real with y'all like I always have. There have been some times, man. Well, I have been drinking and I've been drunk and I should have never been driving. But you know, if you're a drinker, you know how sometimes you get that courage, like I can do it, I can do it, and I can do it. You know what I'm saying? And I just thank God for letting me make it home every freaking time that I have been that way. I don't even go out like that no more. So I haven't done that in a long time, but I'm just saying, man, if you a drink out there, if you like to drink your alcoholic beverages when you go out, you know how we sometimes really don't need to be behind that wheel, but we still get behind it. I'll slow down on that, but I'm saying I have never been like Nestor. There have never been a time where I've been that freaking drunk where I wouldn't realize that I hit somebody and now they dead body is in my damn passenger seat. I ain't never been that drunk, man. That is crazy. I digress. Let's go.
Earlier this year, we announced our very first MrBallen book, a graphic.
Yeah, the MrBallen book, y'all. Hold on, we getting real close. I've been ordered my book, man. October the 1st. I've been ordered the book. But that's just crazy, y'all. Like, I'm gonna be honest, man. I've been behind the wheel sometime when I shouldn't have, but I ain't never been that goddamn drunk. Hell no. Let's go.
On the afternoon of December 15th, 1997, a brand new mother named Luz Cuevas sat on her couch in her little apartment in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, cradling her beautiful 10-day-old baby girl who she had named Delamar Vera. And in the room with Luz and her daughter were some members of Luz's extended family who had come over to meet the baby. And so for about an hour, the family all took turns, holding the baby and complimenting how cute her little dimples looked. And then eventually the baby started to get fussy, at which point Luz said she was going to take her upstairs and put her to bed. And so Luz brought Delamar upstairs to her nursery, and she put the baby down in her crib, and she stayed with her for a bit until Delamar finally had kind of dozed off to sleep. And so after being sure that her daughter wasn't going to stir, Luz got up and she began making her way towards the door, and right before she left, she made sure to plug in the space heater for her daughter's room to make sure it would stay warm enough while her daughter slept. And then after that, she left the room, shut the nursery door, and went back downstairs to rejoin her family. Luz's family didn't stick around much longer after Luz came downstairs, and after they were all gone, Luz realized she was totally exhausted and her daughter was still fast asleep upstairs, and so Luz decided she would also lie down and try to take a nap herself. But as soon as she closed her eyes, she heard this loud thud sound coming from the second floor, and it sounded like something really heavy had smashed into the ground, and she's thinking, her daughter's up there. Could that be her daughter somehow falling out of the crib or something? And so Luz jumped up, sprinted upstairs, and as she looked down the hall, she could clearly see there was black smoke billowing out of her daughter's nursery. And so Luz charges down the hall, she opens up the door, and she looks into her daughter's room, and it's completely engulfed in flames. I mean, everything is on fire, but it's her baby girl in there, and so without any hesitation, Luz charges into the inferno. But when she gets up to the crib, the crib is so completely on fire that when she looks in, she can't even see her daughter.
Man, see, this is why I was shaking my head from the beginning when MrBallen said that she cut that space heater on and closed that door. Me personally, man, I would never freaking do that. My mama always used to get on us as a child, man, about don't fall asleep with that goddamn heater on. You know what I'm saying? Don't fall asleep with that space heater on. And you most definitely, she closed the door on top of that. And from everything MrBallen already said, I hate to say it, but I think this little child did. Let's find out.
And so in a craze, she begins looking around the room thinking maybe my daughter did fall out of the crib and she's somewhere else in the room, but everything is on fire. She can't see anything. And so as Luz is literally catching on fire and breathing in all the smoke, she's screaming for her daughter. And then a couple of minutes later, firefighters burst into the door and they literally drag Luz out of the nursery. She hasn't found her daughter. She's screaming, where's my baby? But the firefighters, they bring her outside. And just a couple of minutes later, they were able to extinguish this blaze. And after they came out of the house again, they found Luz, who had all these terrible burns in her body, and she's totally messed up from this fire. And they tell her that unfortunately, her daughter was dead. After Delamar's death, Luz's life completely fell apart. I mean, the grief was so immense. It was like she could no longer function in society. I mean, she actually retracted from the world, stopped interacting with people, didn't see her family. She wound up getting a divorce from her husband just over the grief and the sadness of losing this child. I mean, it was like her life basically ended when her daughter's life ended. But on top of that, Luz also felt this incredible sense of guilt because after the fire, the investigators told her that the cause of the fire, although not conclusive, was very likely from that space heater she had plugged in right before she had left the room. And so of course, Luz is feeling this incredible burden for having potentially killed her daughter, but also she just began to obsess over the details because again, it wasn't conclusive that it was the space heater. That was their best guess as to what caused the fire. And so Luz began to wonder, was it something else? Was it preventable? What was it? Basically, Luz became completely obsessed with what happened to her daughter. It was like the only thing she ever thought of for years. Fast forward to January 24th, 2004, so 6 years after the fire. And on this day, Luz was invited to a family party. There was a get-together, and Luz basically never went to any family function or really left her house much at all. But for some reason, on this day, she decided to go out. And so she goes to this party, and when she gets there, remember, Luz has basically been a recluse for the past 6 years. And so she's not going to immediately start socializing. And so instead, she just goes in the house and kind of finds a spot in the back, kind of away from everybody else who's chatting, and just stands there, kind of people watching. And as she's...
What if Luz freaking find out that somebody else did that to her daughter? Like somebody set that damn room on fire. And it's one of her family members. That'll be crazy.
Doing that, something catches her attention off to the side. And when she turns to look at it and sees what it is, she immediately just freezes. 3 days later, Luz walked into the office of a local state legislator, and after saying hello, she sat down, reached into her purse, and pulled out a little plastic bag that contained a folded up napkin. And she slid it across the table to the legislator. And so he picked up the bag and stared at it inquisitively as Luz dove into this wild explanation about what was in this bag and why she was here. And at the end of this totally off-the-wall, insane-sounding story, the legislator was left just kind of staring at Luz and looking back at the bag in total shock. And then finally, after a couple of moments of silence, the legislator just said, "Okay, yeah, I'll see what I can do." It would turn out the fire was not caused by the space heater that Luz had plugged in right before she left her daughter's room. Instead, police believe after Luz came downstairs and tried to take a nap, somebody broke into her apartment, went into the nursery, and set the fire on purpose, but not before abducting the baby.
Oh.
And that person was one of Luz's own family members who had been at her apartment that day celebrating the birth of Della Marvera. It was Luz's husband's cousin, Carolyn Correa. And in fact, on this same day, before the fire and before the abduction, Carolyn made a point to announce to the whole family that she was pregnant, even though she wasn't. It was just going to be her cover story for why she suddenly had this brand new baby. 6 years later, when Luz was at that family party, well, the thing that caught her attention on the other side of the room was her daughter. She literally saw her daughter, and even though she hadn't seen her in 6 years, she instantly knew it was her because of her distinctive dimples. Now, Luz knew she couldn't just suddenly yell out like, "That's my daughter!" So instead, she came up with this plan. She walked up to the girl and very discreetly said, "Hey, honey, I think you got some gum in your hair." And so as she pretended to pull gum out of the child's hair, she carefully plucked a few strands and put them inside of a napkin and put it inside of her pocket. And then 3 days later, she brought that hair inside of that plastic baggie and she gave it to the legislator and basically said, "Here's what I think happened. I think she stole my kid. Can you test it for DNA to prove that girl is my daughter?" And the legislator was like, "Okay, I'll give it a shot." And lo and behold, that hair would prove that girl at the party was her daughter. She did not die in that fire. Carolyn Correa was sentenced to 9 to 30 years in prison for abduction. She originally had an arson charge against her as well, but investigators could not actually prove how the fire started, and so they ultimately dropped those charges. Officials also launched an inquiry into how the fire department had handled the original investigation, because Luz had tried to convince fire officials that, maybe her daughter had not died in the blaze, maybe she was just missing, because when Luz went into the nursery, she claimed she couldn't even find her daughter, but investigators had told her that the fire had burned so hot that basically her daughter had been totally incinerated, and that's why she couldn't find her. In the end, though, because of her refusal to ever give up, Luce was ultimately reunited with her daughter, Delamar.
Man, oh man, oh man.
Okay, so if you're not listening,
That one right there was one of the most what the is going on that ended very wholesomely with seeing Luce reunited with Delamar 6 years later. I thought that maybe a family member had killed little Delamar. No, Carolyn went and stole her. That and made it set it up to make it look like the little girl had died in a fire. And I feel like Luce need to get some money from that fire department. Seriously, you need to goddamn sue them for pain and suffering or something, because it was not, like, I can understand that they saying that the fire burned so hot to the point where her body just incinerated and the ashes dust to dust. But still, man, it should have been some kind of investigation. It still should have been some kind of investigation to try to find some type of piece of DNA from her body in that fire. You know what I'm saying, man? I feel like they kind of like just kind of brushed over it a little bit too much or a little too fast. That is freaking crazy, man. On so many levels, man. Like, what the freak? What, like, not only the fact that you stole her, but think about Luce in that moment going to this party. This lady been going through it for 6 freaking years, thinking that she is the reason that her daughter is not with us no more. She go to this party and she look like holy sugar honey iced tea. That's my little girl 6 years later. And she did it so smart too. Shout out to her for not even just causing a scene or nothing. She went over there and just got a little pieces of hair out of her head. You know what I'm saying, man? And took it the route that she should have took it to get her daughter back. And Carolyn's stupid. Like, Carolyn's just stupid on so many levels, man. I don't even know if what MrBallen said, she got like 9 to 30 years. I would have gave her ass 50. I'm just saying, man, I would have gave her ass 50 years for that shit, man. You don't kidnap no freaking child, period. And then the fact that you kidnap, what she was Luce's husband's cousin. That is so sick, man. It's like, not only are you low down to Luce, you low down to the little girl too, but you low down to your cousin, the husband. You know what I'm saying, man? He ain't even freaking know. Like, what? That is freaking wild, man. That one is wild. The first one is just as wild, or even wilder, man. Freaking what his name? Nestor, that goddamn drunk, y'all. So he drove 40 more goddamn miles, went inside a restaurant, got all this freaking blood on him, walked back out, fall asleep, and never realized that there's a freaking body in your passenger seat, bro. Like, you gotta be drunk as hell, man. That is freaking crazy, man. These was two crazy MrBallen stories, y'all. But I digress. I'm gonna go and let y'all go, man. I appreciate y'all coming on back, as always. And before y'all leave, as always, just please hit that like button, comment, subscribe, and do all that if you ain't did that yet. And make sure that y'all come back Tuesday, because Jose Ortiz from Evil Intentions has put out a new video, and we gonna get into it. And until then, my friends, also remember this: love, peace, and happiness. Stay safe. Don't stop. Keep going. Yeah.